The fire has that steady sound again. Not loud, not trying to be heard, just doing its work in the dark. The night is out there like it always is. I can feel someone sitting close enough to listen. That's plenty. I knew a man once named James, and he was close to me in the plain way people can be close without ever stepping into each other, like two houses on the same street, or two chairs in the same room, always there, always in the same place, but with a space between them that never really changes. He worked where I worked for a time in a building that smelled like damp coats in winter and warm dust in summer. And our paths were the same every day, so much the same that I could have walked them with my eyes shut, and he could have too. We came in through the same door in the morning. We hung our coats on hooks that were never quite far enough apart, and we washed our hands at the same sink, one after the other, as if the sink belonged to the routine more than to us. James had a habit of tapping his pocket before he sat down, like he was making sure his keys were still there. It was quick, just a little pat, and he did it every time, even when we had been sitting for an hour and there was no reason to check again. He also had a way of pulling his sleeves down over his wrists, even when it wasn't cold, not fussy, not nervous, just a small act, like putting a lid on something. If you worked beside him long enough, you learned his small signs the way you learn the sounds of a house. You could tell when he was tired because he would blink more slowly. You could tell when he was annoyed because he would set things down harder than he needed to, not loud, just firm. You could tell when he was thinking because he would stare at a spot on the wall above the workbench, not looking at anything in the room, but somewhere behind it. We spoke every day, but the talk was thin. Morning, how's it going? Did you see the weather? They say it'll rain. Things like that. The kind of talk that keeps the air from feeling empty, but doesn't bring anyone closer. There was another man, Henry, who liked to fill silence with jokes, and he tried with James too. Henry would say something silly about the boss, or about the price of meat, and he would look at James, waiting for a laugh. James would give him a short smile, polite, almost kind, but it never turned into a real laugh. It was like James had a gate inside him, and the gate stayed shut most of the time, not because he was cruel, but because he didn't know how to open it, or didn't want to. Or maybe he had opened it once in his life and didn't like what came in. I don't mean he was cold all the time. He wasn't. There were small moments where he was decent in a way you didn't forget. If someone dropped something heavy, James would move without thinking and help lift it. If a new boy started and didn't know where things were kept, James would point without making the boy feel stupid. If the kettle was empty, James would fill it, not for praise, just because it needed filling. And still, for all that, he stayed far. We lived near each other for a while too. Not the same house, but close. So close you could see each other's windows from the street. I lived with my wife then, Sarah, and our children, and James lived alone in a small place that had a narrow porch with a step that always looked like it needed fixing. His curtains were usually half closed, even in the day, not hiding, just half closed, like he liked the room to be dim. We saw each other on the street most mornings. I would be walking with my lunch tin, and he would be a few steps ahead, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly up if it was cold. If I caught up, I would say, "Morning, James," and he would nod without stopping and say, "Morning." Then we would walk side by side for a few minutes, steps matching because the sidewalk made you match, and then, without either of us planning it, he would drift a little ahead again, as if he needed space, even in a shared walk. At the corner near the bakery, he always looked down for a moment, like he was checking the ground. I noticed it because he did it every day. One winter, there was a crack in the pavement there that caught water and turned into a strip of ice, and he nearly slipped once. After that, he looked down every morning, even when the weather was dry, like the body remembers danger longer than the mind does. Once, in late fall, I saw him carrying groceries into his house. He had a brown paper bag under one arm and a smaller bag in his hand. The wind was sharp. He was trying to open his door while holding the bags. The paper looked like it might tear. I walked over and said, "Need a hand?" He paused, and for a second, I thought he might say no out of habit, but then he nodded once. I took the smaller bag. It was heavier than it looked. Cans, maybe. He got the door open and stepped inside. His house smelled of plain things, soap, old wood, a faint smell of boiled vegetables that had cooled. The entryway was neat, shoes lined against the wall, a coat on a hook, nothing out of place. I stepped in just enough to set the bag down on a chair he had near the door. James said, "Thanks." He stood there with the other bag still under his arm, not moving deeper into the house, not inviting me in, but not pushing me out either. I stood there too, hands empty now, not knowing if the moment wanted a second line or wanted to be done. I said, "No problem." James nodded. He looked at the bag I had carried, like he was making sure it hadn't been dropped. Then he said, "Cold coming." I said, "Yeah." He said, "They say snow." I said, "We'll see." Then he shifted the bag higher under his arm and stepped to the side, and that was the sign. I stepped back out. He closed the door, gently, not fast, not rude, just closed. That was how it always was. A chance to be closer would appear, and James would allow it just enough to be polite. Then the door would close again, softly, like a habit. I saw it in the small ways. At work, during breaks, men would sit around a table and talk about their kids, their wives, their troubles. Not deep talk, but more than weather. My boys got a cough. My wife wants a new stove. My mother's not well. Men would nod, offer a line, sometimes offer help. James would sit at the edge of the table, drink his coffee, and listen. Sometimes he would say, "That's rough," or hope he feels better, and then he would go quiet again, like he had paid his part and didn't want to owe more. The truth was, we knew almost nothing about him. We knew he had no wife living with him. We knew he didn't go to the bar much. We knew he had a sister because once a woman came by the shop asking for him, and he went outside to talk to her, and his face looked different for a moment, softer and also tired. We knew he sent letters sometimes because he would buy stamps at the store and tuck them in his pocket carefully. We didn't know where the letters went. There was an older woman down the street named Mary who liked to know everyone's business. She once said to Sarah that James keeps to himself, makes you wonder. Sarah had shrugged and said, "Some people are just quiet." Mary had made a face like she didn't believe in quietness. But Sarah was right. Some people are quiet, and some people are quiet as a way of keeping distance. One evening, when the days were short, I saw James standing outside his house, just on the porch, smoking. He didn't smoke often, not that I had seen, but that night he was. The smoke drifted out into the cold air. He was looking up at the sky, but not at the stars, because there weren't many stars, just cloud. He was just looking up. I had taken the trash out. I stood by my own steps a moment. I didn't want to go back in right away, because the house was loud with children and dishes and the clatter of a day ending. The air outside was still. My breath showed. I called over softly, "Evening." James turned his head. The ember of his cigarette glowed. He nodded. "Evening," he said. I could have walked over. It wasn't far. I could have asked him how he was. I could have said something about the cold. But there was something in the way he stood that felt like a wall. Not angry, just firm, like a closed gate. So I stayed where I was. We stood like that for a minute, two men in the same cold air, close enough to speak, far enough to stay alone. James smoked. I watched the trash can lid settle back into place after I let it go. The lid made a soft metal sound. Then James said, almost to himself, "They get noisy, don't they?" I knew he meant my children. The sound had carried through the walls earlier. The high voices, the running feet. I said, "Yeah." I waited, not pushing, letting him choose if he wanted more. James took another pull of smoke and let it out slow. He said, "Must be good." He didn't say it like he was jealous. He said it like he was stating a fact, like, "Must be warm." I said, "It's a lot." James nodded. He looked down at the cigarette in his fingers. Then he said, "All right." He turned and went inside. The porch light flicked off a second later. I stood there a moment longer, then went back into my own house. After that, I noticed his porch light more. Sometimes it was on late. Sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes his curtains moved slightly, like he was walking past the window. That was the extent of what I knew. A light, a curtain, a step on a porch that needed fixing. One winter, James got sick. Not the kind of sick where a man drops in the street, just the kind that keeps you home. A cough that won't leave, a fever that makes your eyes dull. He didn't show up for work for 3 days. Henry joked at first, said maybe James had finally gone to find himself a woman. Then Mr. Reed, the boss, told Henry to shut up and asked me if I had seen James. I said I lived near him. Mr. Reed said, "Go check." It wasn't a kindness, it was a problem to solve. They needed James back. I walked over after work. It was already dark. Snow had fallen in thin layers. James's porch light was on, which was something. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Still no answer. I stood there, listening. I could hear a faint sound inside, like movement, like someone dragging a foot. At last, the door opened a crack. James's face appeared in the gap, pale eyes, red. He looked at me like he didn't know who I was at first. Then his mind caught up. He said, "What?" His voice was rough. I said, "Just checking." Mr. Reed's asking. James blinked. He coughed once, deep, and turned his head away to cough into his elbow. Then he opened the door wider. "Come in," he said, like it cost him something to say it. Inside, the house was warmer than I expected. A small stove was going. The air smelled of medicine and sweat. There was a pot on the stove with something in it, maybe water, maybe broth. The room was still neat, but there were signs of trouble. A blanket on the chair, a cup on the table with a ring of dried tea around the inside, a bowl with a spoon left in it. James stood there in his shirt sleeves, too thin for the cold outside. His sleeves were pulled down over his wrists, like always. He looked tired enough that his bones seemed closer to the skin. I said, "You all right?" He shrugged, then coughed again. He said, "It'll pass." I nodded. I didn't know what else to do. I wasn't his family. I wasn't his friend in the way that gives you rights. I was just a man who lived nearby. I said, "You need anything?" James looked at me. For a second, his eyes held something like surprise, like no one asked him that often. Then the wall came back. He shook his head. "No," he said, "just time." I nodded. I looked around and saw the woodpile near the stove was low. I said, "You're low on wood." James followed my glance. He said, "I'll get it." I said, "Not in this." I gestured toward the cold outside. "I'll bring you some." James didn't argue. He didn't thank me yet either. He just sat down on the chair, like his legs needed it. I went outside, crossed to my yard, grabbed a few pieces of dry wood, carried them back. I set them by his stove. James watched me do it. His face didn't change much. When I finished, I stood there with my hands empty again, feeling awkward in his neat room with his private air. I said, "I'll tell Mr. Reed you're sick." James nodded. I started to step toward the door. Then James said, quietly, "Thanks." It was small. It was real. I said, "Sure." I left. He closed the door gently again, like always. He came back to work a week later, thinner, still coughing now and then. Men slapped him on the back and made jokes. He nodded and gave short smiles. He didn't talk about being sick. He didn't talk about being alone. He just went back to his bench and did his work. That was James. Close enough that you saw him every day, that you knew his walk, his habits, his pocket tap, his sleeve pull, the way he looked down at the crack in the pavement, far enough that you never truly stepped into his life. You could stand at his door and carry him wood and still not know where his heart went at night. After some years, I moved. Work shifted. The children grew. Life did what it does. I heard later that James moved too, out of town. Someone said he went to live near his sister. Someone else said he died. I never got the true line. It didn't matter. What stayed with me was the feeling of that closeness that never turned into anything warmer. That strange thing where a person can be right there in your day, almost part of your own routine, and still you can't reach them. Not because you didn't try hard enough, but because there are people who live behind a door that stays closed even when the light is on. I worked with someone years ago who had a different kind of boundary in his life, and it made me think about lines people dainty cross even when they stand close to them, lines that are drawn not in anger but in simple facts. His name was Robert. He was steady, not loud, and he had a calm way of moving that made you trust him with a task. He worked on deliveries, loading and unloading, keeping track of lists, moving crates and sacks, and making sure nothing was lost. He had a wife, Anna, and 2 children. He spoke of them in small ways, not in speeches. He would say, "Anna made stew," or "the boys got new shoes," and that was enough to know his home existed and mattered. There was a woman in the same place we worked named Emily. She wasn't young, but she wasn't old either. She wore simple dresses and a plain coat. And she had hair that always looked like it had been brushed in a hurry and then pinned up so it wouldn't tea-fall. She worked in the office side, doing papers, checking numbers, answering questions from men who didn't like paperwork. Robert and Emily were near each other every day because the work made them near. He would come in with delivery notes, and she would take them, read them, write something down, and hand them back. He would stand by her desk while she did it, not leaning, not crowding, just there. Emily would keep her eyes on the paper most of the time, but now and then she would glance up at him, like she was checking his face for something, maybe honesty, maybe mood. It wasn't a secret romance. It wasn't even a romance in the usual way. It was a kind of pull that showed up slowly, mostly in the space between words. At first, it looked like simple respect. Robert would say, "Thanks," and Emily would say, and go back to her work. Robert would wait if she was busy, hands at his sides, patient. Emily would notice that he didn't press her. She would notice he didn't slam papers on her desk the way some men did. She would notice he didn't call her girl like some of them did. He called her by her name. "Emily," he would say, as if her name was a real thing. One day, Emily had a headache. You could see it because she kept rubbing her temple with 2 fingers when she thought no one was looking. She was trying to keep working, but her eyes were tired. Robert came in with papers and saw her do it. He didn't say, "Are you sick?" Not like a man who wants to know everything. He just said, "You all right?" Emily looked up and gave a small shake of her head. "Just a headache," she said. Robert nodded. He left and came back later with a small jar. He set it on her desk without a word. It was some kind of ointment, the kind people rub on their temples. Emily looked at it, surprised. Robert said, "Anna uses it." Emily's mouth tightened for a second at the mention of Anna, not because she disliked her, but because the name reminded her of the line that existed. Then she said, "Thank you." Robert nodded once and took his papers and left. After that, Emily kept the jar in her desk drawer. Sometimes, when she had a headache again, she would take it out, rub a little on her fingers, and touch her temples, and the smell would fill the small office space. It reminded her that Robert had noticed her pain, and also that the help had come from a husband, from a family, from a life that was not hers. Robert and Emily did not meet outside work, not at first. They did not write letters. They did not make excuses. They did not talk about feelings. They lived in the same town, but in different parts. Emily lived with her mother, who was old and needed care. Robert lived with Anna and the children in a house that always had laundry on the line when the weather allowed. But they saw each other every day. And when you see someone every day, you start to learn them. You learn what time they arrive. You learn how they hold a pen. You learn the sound of their shoes on the floor. You learn when they are quiet because they are tired, and when they are quiet because they are holding something in. Emily learned that Robert always washed his hands before he came to her desk, even if he had just washed them 10 minutes earlier. He didn't want to leave dirt on her papers. Robert learned that Emily always lined up her pencils, and if someone moved one, she would move it back without thinking. Like straightness calmed her. There were days when work was slow. The warehouse side would be quiet. The office side would have fewer calls. On those days, Robert would come in with a paper that didn't need to be signed right away, and he would stand at Emily's desk a moment longer than needed. Emily would sign, hand it back, and then, instead of looking down again, she would ask, "How's your boy doing?" It was safe talk. It stayed inside the line. Robert would answer, "He's fine, won't stop running." Emily would nod. She would say, "Mine was like that," even though she didn't have children. But she meant her brother when he was young. Or maybe she meant the children she had watched for neighbors. Robert would smile a little. Then he would leave. That would be it. But the moments stacked up. Small moments can stack like wood. You don't notice the pile until it's there. One evening, a storm came in fast. Rain hit the windows hard. The roof in the warehouse leaked in one corner, and they had to move sacks away from the drip. Men cursed, not at anything in particular, just at wetness. Emily stayed late because the papers had to be fixed. Robert stayed late because the moving had to be done. When the storm finally eased, it was already dark. The building was quieter. Most men had left. Emily was in the office still, lamplight on her desk, writing. Robert finished in the warehouse and came to drop off a note about what had been moved. He came into the office and found her alone. Emily looked up when he entered. Her face looked tired, the way it does when you've been holding yourself upright for too long. Robert held the paper in his hand, then hesitated, as if he didn't want to break the quiet. He said, "Still here." Emily nodded. "Still here," she said, like it was a rule she had to follow. Robert set the note on her desk. Emily glanced at it. She said, "All right." Robert didn't leave right away. He stood there, hands at his sides, rainwater still on his coat sleeves. Emily could hear the faint drip outside where the storm had left water. She could hear the tick of a clock. Robert said, "Anna will wonder where I am." Emily's throat tightened at that. She said, "Then you should go." Robert nodded. "Yes," he said, but he didn't move. Emily looked down at her paper. She made her pen move, but she wasn't really writing anything new. She was just making lines, because stopping felt like stepping into something. Robert said, quietly, "You shouldn't be here alone this late." Emily said, "I'm fine," Robert said. Still, he shifted his weight. Emily could hear his boots on the floor, the squeak of leather. She looked up then and met his eyes. It wasn't a long look, not in the way people imagine. It was just long enough that both of them knew they were standing too close to the line. Emily said, "Robert." His name sounded different in her mouth. Robert swallowed. He said, "Yes." Emily's fingers tightened around her pen. She said, "Go home." Robert nodded, once, slow. "All right," he said. Then he turned and walked out, and Emily watched the door close behind him. The next day, they were back in routine. Robert brought papers. Emily signed them. They spoke about safe things. The storm night wasn't mentioned, but the air had changed a little. It was like a board in a floor that creaks after you step on it once. You can't unhear it. After that, they were more careful. Robert didn't linger by the desk as long. Emily didn't ask as many questions. When she did, she kept them short. When Robert smiled, he kept it small. It wasn't punishment, it was caution. They knew the line. and they respected it, not because they were saints, but because they understood what stepping over it would do. It would not only affect them, it would crack open Robert's home, Anna's life, the children's quiet trust. It would pull Emily away from her mother, who needed her. It would turn the town's slow gossip into sharp looks. It would make work heavy. And still, there was the pull. It didn't go away because they chose to be good. It just sat there quietly, like hunger you don't feed. One afternoon, Emily's mother got worse. Emily had to leave work early and go home. She looked pale. Her hands shook a little when she put papers into her bag. Robert saw her from across the room and walked over, not fast, not making a show, just moving toward her because he had noticed. He said, "What's wrong?" Emily's lips pressed tight. She said, "It's my mother." Robert nodded. He didn't ask details. He said, "Need a ride?" Emily hesitated. A ride was a line too. It wasn't a kiss, but it was a private space. Still, it was raining again, light rain, and Emily's mother was waiting, and Emily's feet felt heavy. She said, "If you can," Robert said. "I can." He went to get his coat. Emily stood by the door, holding her bag close, staring at the floor like she was trying not to think. Robert drove her home in his truck. The cab smelled like damp wool and a faint smell of tobacco that clung to the fabric, even if Robert didn't tea smoke much. Emily sat with her hands in her lap. Robert kept both hands on the wheel. The rain tapped on the glass. The road was muddy in places. They didn't talk much. At one point, Robert said, "Anna knows I'm dropping papers at the school sometimes." That was his way of saying, "I'm not lying. I'm not hiding this ride in the dark." Emily nodded. She said, "All right." Her voice was small. When they reached her house, Robert stopped the truck. Emily reached for the door handle, then paused. For a second, she didn't move. Robert didn't move either. The rain kept tapping. Emily said, "Thank you." Robert said, "Sure." Emily opened the door. Cold air came in. She stepped out. Robert watched her walk up to her door. She didn't look back. He didn't call after her. He just waited until she was inside, then drove away. That was the boundary. They helped each other. They cared. They felt the tension, and they stayed inside the line, even when it would have been easy for a moment to step over. Because stepping over is often easy in the moment. It's the after that's hard. In time, Robert got transferred to another place. Emily stayed. The line didn't break because the distance arrived first. They saw each other once in a while after, at the market, at church, in the street. They nodded. They spoke politely. Their eyes would hold a second longer than usual, then let go. Life went on. This reminds me of a moment I saw once that was so quiet it almost didn't count as anything. And yet it was the kind of moment people carry inside for years. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was close to being something that could not be taken back. There was a woman I met when I was older than I should have been to be getting tangled up in new feelings. Her name was Sarah, too. Not my wife, a different Sarah. And maybe that's why it stays with me. Because names repeat like days repeat, and you can get confused for a second, even years later, about which life you're thinking of. This Sarah lived above a small shop. She was a widow, not long widowed, but long enough that the black clothes had been put away and the town had stopped saying "poor thing" in every sentence. She worked part-time at the library, shelving books, stamping returns, helping children find what they needed. She had a calm face. She didn't wear much jewelry. Her hands were always clean, and she smelled faintly of paper and soap. I saw her often because my work took me past the library every morning. Not inside, usually, just past the building. I walked the same route. I was a creature of habit then. I had obligations, bills, a family at home. I didn't stop to look at women in windows. I didn't think I had room for any of that. But you can't stop your eyes from noticing what they notice. And you can stop your mind from picking up a person's small habits when you see them over and over. Sarah would open the library door each morning a little before the official time. She would unlock it, step inside, then prop it open for a moment to let air move through. She would stand in the doorway with her keys in her hand and look down the street, not waiting for anyone, just looking. Sometimes she would see me pass, sometimes she wouldn't. Over months, the nod became normal. Then a few words: morning, cold, today, windy, looks like rain. The same thin talk people use to keep a street friendly. One day, I had to go into the library to check a date in a record book for work. The library was quiet. The floorboards creaked in places. The smell of books was thick in the air, the way it is in old rooms. Sarah was behind the desk, writing something in a ledger. I stood there and waited until she looked up. Her eyes were a steady brown, not sharp, not sleepy, just steady. She said, "Can I help you?" I told her what I needed. She nodded and walked to a shelf, her steps soft, careful, like she respected the room. She pulled out a big book and set it on the desk with both hands, like it was heavy with more than paper. She turned the pages for me, slow, not rushing. Her fingers were clean. She paused now and then to read a line. I stood beside her, close enough that I could smell her soap. It was ordinary soap. Nothing fancy. Still, I noticed it because it was close. When I found what I needed, I said, "Thanks." She nodded. "All right," she said. And I should have left, but I didn't leave right away. I stood there a moment too long, looking at the pages as if I had missed something. Sarah waited, patient. Then she said, "You walk by every day." It wasn't a question. It was a simple fact. I said, Yes. She nodded, as if she was placing that fact in her mind. Then she said, "You always look like you're thinking." That line caught me off guard, because it was true. I had been thinking a lot in those days, thinking about money, about my wife's tiredness, about how little time we had, about how life felt already set, heavy like a cart that had been loaded and couldn't be unloaded without spilling everything. I gave a short smile and said, "Too much thinking." Sarah's mouth moved slightly, almost a smile. She said, "Same." Then she picked up her pen again, and the moment ended, but it didn't disappear. It stayed in the space between us like a small object left on a table. After that, I found myself going into the library more often. Not every day, not enough to look like a fool. Just now and then, with a reason that was real enough. A book for my son. A question about a record. A newspaper I could have bought elsewhere. Each time, Sarah would look up, nod, and help. We began talking more, quiet talks, nothing that sounded like courtship. Sarah would ask, "How's your family?" I would answer, "They're fine." Sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't. Sarah would say, "Busy time," and I would nod. She would tell me about a child who had come in looking for a book and left with a stack too heavy to carry. I would tell her about a delivery gone wrong, or a man at work who had dropped a crate on his foot. Small life talk, and there was always that line. I had a wife. I had children. Sarah knew it. She never asked for details, but she knew. I mentioned them because they were part of my days. "My daughter's been sick," I would say. Sarah would nod and say, "I hope she feels better," and that would be it. Sarah had her own line too. She wasn't married anymore, but she was tied to her past in a quiet way. Her husband had been a decent man, by what people said. He had died suddenly, a sickness that took him faster than anyone expected. Sarah spoke of him rarely, but when she did, her voice went flatter, like she was keeping it under control. She still lived in the rooms they had shared. She still had his chair by the window. You could feel his presence, even if you never met him. So we were two people with lines around us. Mine was living and still there in my house. Hers was gone, but still there in her rooms. And there was the town. Always the town. Always eyes, not cruel eyes, just curious. We kept it quiet. We kept it inside the safe places, the library desk, the doorway, the street nod. Sometimes we would stand outside the library when she took her break, just a few minutes, and talk about the weather. I would keep my hands in my pockets. She would hold her mug with both hands. It went like that through a season, then another. The talks got a little longer. The pauses got a little more loaded. Still, nothing happened. Not really. Not in the way people mean when they say something happened then. There was a day in late winter when the library had to close early because the pipes froze. Sarah came out to put a sign on the door. The air was cold enough to make your eyes water. I was walking by with my collar up. Sarah saw me and said, "Closed today." I stopped. I said, "Frozen." She nodded. "Frozen." She rubbed her hands together, then tucked them into her coat pockets. Her cheeks were red. Her hair had come a little loose near her ear. I said, "That's trouble." She nodded. "They'll fix it tomorrow," she said, but her voice didn't sound sure. She stood there, looking at the sign, then looking down the street. The street was empty. The cold had chased people inside. The quiet felt bigger than usual. Sarah said, "I hate going back up there when it's this quiet." She meant her rooms above the shop. Quiet can feel safe, but it can also feel like a hollow thing that echoes. I should have said something polite and moved on, but I didn't. I said, "You can come have tea at my place if you want." The words came out before I weighed them. They were simple words. They could be innocent. They could also be dangerous. Sarah looked at me. Her eyes were steady, but there was a flicker in them, like surprise and something else. She didn't answer right away. She looked down at her boots. She shifted her weight. Then she said, "I shouldn't." It was quiet, not scolding, just a fact. I nodded. I said, "No, you're right." I tried to smile like it was nothing. The cold air made the smile stiff. Sarah looked up again. She said, "It's kind of you." I said, "It's just tea." She gave a small breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. She said, "It's never just tea." Then she looked away, as if she regretted the line. We stood there, two people in the cold, outside a closed library, with a sign on the door, flapping slightly in the wind. My hands were still in my pockets. Her hands were in hers. The street was empty. The air felt sharp. Sarah said, "I'll go." I said, "All right." She turned to go up the stairs to her rooms. I turned to keep walking. Then, after a few steps, I heard her say my name. I stopped and turned back. She was halfway up the stairs, one hand on the rail. She looked down at me. She said, "Thank you for seeing me." That's what she said. Not for offering tea. Not for being kind. For seeing her. Like she had been invisible for a long time, and the fact of being noticed mattered. My chest felt full and empty at the same time. I said, "Of course." My voice sounded rough. Sarah nodded once, then went up the stairs. I watched her go inside and close the door behind her. Then I walked home, the cold biting my face, my mind loud even though the street was quiet. After that day, we were more careful, but also closer, which sounds like a contradiction, but it isn't. We spoke less, but when we spoke, the words felt heavier. Sometimes, Sarah would hand me a book without our fingers touching, and the lack of touch would feel like touch. Sometimes, I would stand at the desk, and she would look at my face for a moment longer than needed, then look down quickly, like she had stepped too near the edge. One afternoon, near spring, I came into the library and saw Sarah in the back room, standing on a stool, trying to reach a high shelf. The stool wobbled slightly. She had one hand on the shelf, one hand reaching for a book. Her coat was off. Her sleeves were rolled. Her hair had slipped more loose. She looked like a person doing a plain task, but the sight of her like that struck me with something simple and sharp. I walked over and said, "Careful." That word came out of my mouth without thinking. It was the same word a man might say near a stove, or a ladder, or a hot pan. Sarah looked down and saw me. She froze for a second, then said, "It's fine." But her foot shifted, and the stool tipped a little. I reached out and steadied the stool with my hand. My hand gripped the wood. Her foot stayed on the stool. Her body swayed slightly, and for a second her knee brushed my arm. It wasn't anything. It was just contact. Still, my skin felt it like a signal. Sarah looked down at my hand holding the stool. I looked up at her. Her face was close now, closer than it ever was across the desk. I could see the faint lines near her eyes, the small freckles on her cheek, the way her lips were slightly dry from winter air. She said quietly, "Thank you." She reached for the book again, but she didn't move right away. She stayed just a second longer, her body still, my hand still on the stool, my eyes on her, and that was the moment. Not a kiss, not a confession, just a pause where the line was right there, and both of us could feel how easy it would be to step over it, how little motion it would take, how quiet it could be. Sarah's hand came down and, by accident or not, it touched the top of my hand for a brief second, her fingers brushing my knuckles. It was light. It could have been nothing, but it wasn't nothing. We both held still. The library was quiet. No children in that moment. No footsteps. Just the faint sound of pages settling, the distant creak of the building. Sarah's eyes met mine. Her face didn't ask for anything out loud, but it held a question the way a person can hold a cup and offer it without words. I didn't move. I didn't lean in. I didn't take the offered thing. My hand stayed on the stool, steady, practical. Sarah's fingers lifted away. She stepped down carefully with the book in her hands. I moved my hand away from the stool at the same time, like we had practiced it, like we had agreed without speaking. Sarah held the book to her chest for a moment, then turned and walked back toward the desk. I followed a few steps behind, not too close. At the desk, Sarah set the book down and opened it, as if she needed to check a page. I stood there, hands at my sides, feeling the heat in my face, even though the room was cool. Sarah said, without looking up, "Did you need something?" I swallowed. I said, "Just returning this." I held out a book I had brought. Sarah took it. Our fingers did not touch. She stamped it and set it aside. Then she looked up and said, "All right." Her eyes were calm again, but they had that tired steadiness in them. I nodded. I said, "All right," and I left. Nothing happened after that either, not in the way people mean. I went home. My wife was there. The children were there. Supper was on the table. Life was loud again. Sarah in the library went back to her books and her quiet rooms. We kept seeing each other for a while, but the moment on the stool stayed between us, like a small thing you both know is there, and neither of you touches again. The talks got shorter. The looks got quicker. She would nod. I would nod. Sometimes we spoke of weather again, as if weather could cover what we didn't say. Then, one summer, Sarah left town. Her mother's sister had died in another place, and Sarah went to help settle things. And then she didn't come back. Someone said she took a job in a different library. Someone said she moved in with a cousin. I never asked for the truth. It didn't feel like my right. Sometimes, years later, I would pass a library in another town and smell that paper and soap smell and think of her. Hands on the stool, the brush of her fingers on my knuckles, the pause that held more than any speech could have held. The fire has burned down some. The sound is softer now, more like breathing. The night is the same, but it feels deeper. My hands feel warm on one side and cool on the other. A coal shifts and makes a small crack. It doesn't need anything from us. If you like sitting here listening, you can come back another night. The fire's usually lit around this time. There's always room by the fire.